If you look at a nighttime satellite image of Illinois, the picture tells you everything. In the northeast corner, there's a blinding cluster of light, Chicago and its suburbs glowing like a small sun. But let your eyes drift south and west, and the lights collapse almost instantly. The rest of the state fades into darkness, punctuated only by tiny sparks scattered across enormous distances. Most people see this image and think the same thing. Illinois is Chicago, plus everything else. But here's what nobody talks about. For 9 years, Illinois wasn't one state at all. In 1809, Congress divided Illinois territory into 3 separate judicial districts, each with its own capital, its own courts, and its own legal authority. They operated as 3 quasi-independent governments. A settler in one district might live their entire life without ever interacting with the other 2. And the strangest part, that division never actually ended. It just went underground. If you're interested in how geography shapes politics in ways nobody talks about, subscribe. This channel covers exactly that. But first, you need to understand why Congress created these 3 districts in the first place, and the answer has nothing to do with politics. The territory too big to govern. On February 3, 1809, Congress created Illinois Territory. But the land they drew on the map wasn't just present-day Illinois. It was a staggering expanse that included all of modern Wisconsin, chunks of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and parts of what would become Minnesota. If you overlay a map of Illinois Territory onto modern America, you're looking at a region larger than most European countries, all administered from a handful of tiny settlements, scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Now, here's the problem. Travel between these regions was nearly impossible. There were no roads worth the name, no railroads, no telegraph lines, just dense forest, swampland, and rivers that flooded without warning. A message sent from one end of the territory to the other might take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. The southern settlements around Kaskaskia had been French colonial towns for over a century. These weren't frontier outposts. They were established communities with brick buildings, European-style governance, and trading connections stretching back to the 1600s. The central district near Cahokia was economically tied to St. Louis and the Mississippi River economy. It looked south and west toward Missouri and the Gulf of Mexico, not north toward the Great Lakes. And the northern territories, pure frontier wilderness. The few settlers there had cultural ties to the Great Lakes fur trade and practically nothing in common with the French towns to the south. These weren't 3 parts of one territory. They were 3 different worlds forced under one name, and Congress knew it. That's why they split Illinois into 3 judicial districts, not as administrative convenience, but as an acknowledgement that governing this land as a single unit was impossible. 3 capitals, 3 worlds. Each district got its own capital, and when you compare them, you start to understand just how different these regions really were. The southern district was centered on Kaskaskia. This was a sophisticated French colonial town with a history stretching back to 1703, over a century before Illinois Territory even existed. It had brick buildings, a Catholic church, formal streets laid out in European fashion, and a population that spoke French as often as English. The town had been founded by Jesuit missionaries and had weathered French colonial rule, British occupation, and now American expansion. When George Rogers Clark captured Kaskaskia during the Revolutionary War, he found not a crude frontier settlement, but an established community with generations of history. Kaskaskia would become Illinois' first state capital. It was, by the standards of the frontier, a civilized place, and its residents knew it. The Central District operated from Cahokia, another French settlement just across the river from St. Louis. But Cahokia's economy and culture were oriented entirely toward Missouri. The Mississippi River wasn't a boundary, it was a highway. People in Cahokia traded with St. Louis merchants, married into St. Louis families, and thought of themselves as part of the Mississippi River world. Their livelihoods depended on the flow of goods up and down the Great River, not on anything happening in the forests to the north. The idea that they belonged to the same government as settlers in Wisconsin would have seemed absurd, like telling someone in New Orleans that they share a government with fishermen in Maine. Then there was the Northern District, centered on Shawneetown. This was a frontier outpost named for the Shawnee people who had lived there. While Kaskaskia had brick buildings and Catholic masses, Shawneetown had log cabins and the constant threat of conflict. It was raw, new, and oriented toward the Ohio River and the frontier beyond. Today, Shawneetown has barely 1,000 residents. But this tiny town made history in 1816 when it housed Illinois' first bank. The vault still stands, a squat stone structure that looks almost comically permanent for a town that barely registers on modern maps. It's a reminder that even the wildest parts of the frontier needed financial infrastructure. Here's what makes this remarkable. A settler in Shawneetown had more practical connection to what would become Wisconsin than to Kaskaskia, over 200 miles away through trackless wilderness. Getting from one district capital to another wasn't a matter of days. It could take weeks, if the weather cooperated at all. The three districts didn't just have different governments. They had different economies, different cultures, different languages in daily use, and completely different futures. The split that never healed. And those different futures became reality. Illinois Territory didn't just operate as 3 states, it literally became 3 states. The southern portion became Illinois when it achieved statehood on December 3, 1818. The northern territories were carved off and eventually became Wisconsin in 1848, parts of Michigan in 1837, and Minnesota in 1858. The 3-district system wasn't just an administrative workaround, it was a preview of what geography had already decided. But even within the portion that became Illinois, the divisions persisted. The man tasked with holding it all together was Ninian Edwards, former Chief Justice of Kentucky and the only governor Illinois Territory ever had. Edwards served from 1809 to 1818. The entire lifespan of the territory, he understood his impossible task better than anyone. He couldn't unite 3 regions with different histories, different economies, and different destinies. So he didn't try. Instead, Edwards gave each district enough autonomy to prevent collapse while maintaining just enough federal jurisdiction to keep Washington satisfied. The first elected territorial legislature met from September to December of 1812, but real power remained distributed across the 3 districts. Edwards was managing a confederation, not governing a unified territory. When Illinois became a state, Edwards was immediately elected to the U.S. Senate. He'd done his job. He'd kept the territory from falling apart long enough to achieve statehood. But here's what nobody admits. The consolidation into one state didn't actually unify Illinois. It just papered over divisions that never went away. The 51-mile gamble that created Chicago. The boundary that created modern Illinois wasn't drawn by geography. It was drawn by exhaustion. The original plan placed Illinois' northern border at the southern tip of Lake Michigan. That would have made sense geographically. It would have kept the Great Lakes territories together as a unified region. But the northern portions of Illinois Territory were so difficult to manage, so disconnected from the settlements to the south, that Congress essentially gave up. They extended Illinois' northern boundary 51 miles further north than originally planned, pushing it to 42 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. The reason? To give Illinois access to Lake Michigan and be done with the whole mess. This single decision determined that Chicago would be part of Illinois rather than Wisconsin. Think about what that means. Without those 51 miles, Illinois would have no major port, no access to Great Lakes shipping, no connection to the trade networks that would transform a muddy frontier outpost into one of the world's great cities. Chicago would have become Wisconsin's metropolis, not Illinois'. The entire economic and political balance of the Midwest would look different today. The 51-mile shift created modern Illinois, but it also planted a seed of permanent tension. Chicago was grafted onto Illinois by congressional compromise, not by cultural or economic logic. The city that would come to dominate the state was never really part of it, not in the way that Kaskaskia or Cahokia were. Those towns had grown organically from the land and the river systems around them. Chicago grew because Congress drew a line on a map and said, "Close enough." By the 1850s, Chicago had grown into a rail hub connecting the East Coast to the frontier. By 1900, it was one of the largest cities in the world. Today, the Chicago metropolitan area contains roughly 9.5 million people, more than 2/3 of Illinois' entire population. The tail came to wag the dog. A city that was added to Illinois almost as an afterthought now defines Illinois in the eyes of most Americans. And the rest of the state has never forgotten that Chicago wasn't supposed to be theirs in the first place. There's a footnote to this story that confirms everything. James Shields served as U.S. Senator for Illinois from 1849 to 1855. Then he served as senator for Minnesota from 1858 to 1859. Then, remarkably, he served as senator for Missouri in 1879. He's the only person in American history to serve as senator for 3 different states. And those 3 states, Illinois, Minnesota, and Missouri, map almost perfectly onto the 3 regions that Illinois Territory was divided into back in 1809. Some historians argue this is the only way the original 3-way division is memorialized in American political history. One man's career accidentally preserved the geographic truth that official boundaries tried to erase. Why the lines never disappeared? Look at a map of how Illinois votes today. Look at economic data. Look at where people live and how they identify themselves. The 3-district division from 1809 is still visible. Not because anyone remembers it, but because it reflected geographic realities that never changed. Northern Illinois is Chicago and its suburbs, urban, progressive, oriented toward the Great Lakes and the industrial Midwest. This was the frontier district that became Wisconsin's cultural twin, but ended up in Illinois by those 51 miles. Chicago has more in common with Milwaukee than with any city in southern Illinois. The economic ties, the cultural patterns, the political preferences, they all point north and east toward the Great Lakes world that Chicago was supposed to be part of. When Chicagoans vacation, they go to Wisconsin or Michigan. When they think about their economic competitors, they think about coastal cities. The rest of Illinois barely enters the calculation. Central Illinois is the agricultural heartland. Springfield, Peoria, Bloomington, Champaign. These are the corn and soybean towns, politically moderate, economically tied to commodity markets and manufacturing. This region sits between the 2 extremes, belonging fully to neither. It's the Illinois that most Americans never think about, small cities surrounded by farmland that stretches to every horizon. The University of Illinois anchors the eastern part of this region. State government anchors the west. But the economy here runs on grain elevators and processing plants, not on finance or tourism. And then there's Southern Illinois, what locals call downstate, though that term means different things to different people. This is rural, conservative country with historical ties to Kentucky and Missouri. The Mississippi River still matters here. The accent changes, the food changes. The culture feels more southern than Midwestern. People in Cairo at Illinois' southern tip have more in common with people in Memphis than with people in Chicago. Some towns in this region flew Confederate flags during the Civil War. The cultural divide isn't subtle, it's as obvious as the landscape. These aren't just regions on a map, they're functionally different political entities operating under one flag. They vote differently. Chicago goes one way, downstate goes the other, and central Illinois swings between them. They live differently, they see themselves differently. When Chicagoans talk about Illinois, they mean the metropolitan area. When downstate residents talk about Illinois, they mean everywhere except Chicago. The 1809 division didn't create these differences, it recognized them. And 215 years later, those differences haven't faded. If anything, they've deepened. The secession that's already happening. In recent years, something remarkable has started to happen. Multiple counties in southern and central Illinois have held referendums exploring separation from Illinois or the creation of a new state called New Illinois. These aren't fringe movements organized by a handful of activists. They're appearing on official ballots. County boards are passing resolutions. Thousands of voters are saying yes. The arguments sound familiar. Chicago dominates state politics. Southern and central regions feel unrepresented. The interests of the 3 regions are irreconcilable. Downstate residents complain that Chicago's voting power drowns out their concerns on everything from gun rights to pension policy. Chicago residents counter that downstate couldn't function without the tax revenue the metropolitan area generates. Neither side is entirely wrong. These are the same arguments that led Congress to divide Illinois Territory into 3 districts in 1809. The same geographic logic, the same cultural tensions, the same fundamental question: can you govern 3 different worlds as if they were one? The New Illinois movement has proposed drawing a line that would separate Chicago and its suburbs from the rest of the state. The new state would include roughly 100 of Illinois' 102 counties, but only about 25% of its population. Chicago and Cook County would remain Illinois. Everything else would become something new. It's a modern echo of the 1809 split, but in reverse. Instead of dividing wilderness territories for administrative convenience, it would divide a modern state, because the original administrative convenience never actually unified anything. The secession movements haven't succeeded. Changing state boundaries requires congressional approval, and that's nearly impossible to obtain. The last time Congress approved a state split was 1863. when West Virginia separated from Virginia during the Civil War. But the fact that these movements exist at all tells you something important. The underlying geography and political culture that Ninian Edwards struggled with 215 years ago never truly unified. The three Illinois never became one Illinois. They just learned to share a name, and increasingly, they're questioning whether that sharing still makes sense. The capital the river erased. There's a final chapter to this story, and it's almost too symbolic to be true. Kaskaskia, the southern district seat, Illinois' first state capital, the sophisticated French colonial town that had existed for over a century before Illinois Territory was even created, was repeatedly flooded throughout the 1800s. The Mississippi River, which had made Kaskaskia prosperous, also made it vulnerable. Flood after flood eroded the town's foundations. Then came the catastrophic flood of 1881. The Mississippi didn't just flood Kaskaskia, it shifted course entirely, carving a new channel that placed the town on the wrong side of the river. Kaskaskia, the first capital of Illinois, now sits on the Missouri side of the Mississippi. It remains legally part of Illinois, one of only a handful of places in America that's on the opposite side of its boundary river, but the land itself erased the evidence of what Kaskaskia once was. Today, about 14 people live there. The capital of one of the three original districts, the place where Illinois' first state government convened, doesn't even sit on Illinois soil anymore. The river washed it away. Three destinies under one border. Illinois was divided into three states in 1809. It operated that way for 9 years. When Congress consolidated it in 1818, they didn't unify three regions. They just drew a border around three different worlds. The territory that was too big to govern became a state that was too divided to truly unite. Those worlds still exist. Chicago in the north, oriented toward the Great Lakes and the industrial Midwest. The agricultural heartland in the center, tied to the rhythms of planting and harvest. Southern Illinois along the Mississippi, with its historical ties to Kentucky and Missouri. They vote differently, they live differently, they see themselves differently. Ninian Edwards understood this in 1809. The settlers who lived in three separate districts understood it. The modern residents pushing for secession understand it now. The question Congress never answered when they consolidated Illinois Territory in 1818 is the same question Illinois faces today. Can one border hold three destinies? The satellite image at night gives you the answer. Chicago blazes in the northeast. The rest of the state fades into darkness. 215 years after Congress drew a line around three different worlds and called it one state, the divisions remain exactly as visible as the map itself.